Our next speaker would be an occupant of Asian Studies Center, Asian Studies at the UP Asian Center. So he has researched and published extensively on agrarian reform, rural development, industry studies, regional development, rural unrest, and social movements. Okay, so he is currently the president of Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, Arena, Philippines. So welcome Dr. Eduardo C Tadem.
Maraming salamat, Ronald. I'm deeply appreciative of the previous presentations here, and I really have nothing to add in terms of the Occupy movement. I think a lot has already been said about it, as well as publications, newspaper reports, etc. So I'll veer a bit away from, not just a bit, a whole lot away from this whole issue of the Occupy movement, and focus more on the other half of the forum's title, which is basically anarchism. And being a student of Asian studies, focusing on Southeast Asia, what I'd like to share this morning will be this title, Anarchism as a Way of Life, not just as a political movement or political action experience, but the way peoples and communities, specifically in Southeast Asia, have been living all these years in an anarchist way. So anarchism is a way of life, reflections on stateless Southeast Asian communities. So here goes. Okay, this is just a very general definition of anarchism, and here I would like to emphasize the way Kropotkin used it, of anarchism being a theory of life and conduct, where society is conceived without government and all the other principles which have been already stated here. I would like to focus on this really great book which came out in 2009 by the noted Southeast Asianist scholar James Scott. The title of the book is The Art of Not Being Governed, subtitle An Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia. And this is where I think anarchism is actually practiced as a way of life, in the manner that James Scott looked at this upland Southeast Asia. James Scott is a professor in Yale University, and he has focused on ways that subaltern people, specifically the peasantry, have been resisting dominance all these years. And three previous works of his, Moral Economy of the Peasant, Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Forms of Peasant Resistance, and Seeing Like a State, particularly the chapter on agrarian state projects, have finally led to this book, The Art of Not Being Governed. So, okay, so I'll just be reading my text here and I'll be going through the PowerPoint presentation as I go along. So the social cleavage that shapes much of the Southeast Asian region's history is that between hill peoples and valley peoples. So from there you can see anarchism is in the hills, while conformity is in the valley, in the lowland areas. So this has been a process that has been going on. It's a process of state formation in the valleys and the peopling of hills by the state. But on the other hand, Scott says that there has been always a relationship, a dialectical relationship between the nation state formed in the valleys and the hills, where there is relative autonomy from the state. This fact, however, has been largely absent from the historical record. Not much, if at all, has been written about this particular experience. The concept is about non-state spaces, and this is where the state has difficulty establishing its authority. Now, referring to mountains, swamps, mangrove coasts, deserts, and river deltas. And only the modern state possesses the resources to bring these non-state spaces and the people within them to heel, in other words, under the boot heel of government. Now, the state might, in all seriousness, might call this development, economic progress, literacy, social integration, private, public partnerships, conditional cash transfers, whatever you have. But the real objective of all these programs is to make the economic activity of peripheral societies, where the non-state sector is, taxable and accessible. In other words, to make it serve the interests of the state. Thus, for example, the paddy state. These are states where wet rice agriculture is dominant. Was an enclosure of previously stateless peoples, the permanent association of the state and sedentary agriculture. So here we have a distinction between sedentary wet rice agriculture and the agriculture that takes place in the upland areas. And throughout history, the vast so-called barbarian periphery became a source of working capital by the taking of human captives and bringing them down to the lowland areas. So in such a situation, avoiding the state is a real option, although Scott says that this option is slowly vanishing. Zomia is the term that was used by Scott. Southeast Asia's non-state spaces are much diminished, but it is one of the world's largest in the so-called Southeast Asian Massif. Massif is a series of mountainous ranges that are connected with each other. So he's referring to 2.5 million square kilometers across mainland Southeast Asia, Southwest China, Northeast India, and Bangladesh, home to 80 to 100 million people, hundreds of ethnic identities, and at least 5 language families. And the common denominator of all this is that they occupy high altitudes. The lowest would be 200 meters, the highest would be 4,000 meters. And they are all far from the major population centers and marginal. The term Zomia was coined by Willem van Schendel, and it's actually a term referring to Highlander, which is common to several Tibeto-Burman languages. And the complex ethnic and linguistic mosaic of Zomia has been a puzzle for ethnographers and historians, not to mention would-be rulers. This is Zomia. As you can see, it occupies a whole large area in Southeast Asia of as much as 100 million people. Southwestern China is included here. The 7 northeastern states of India, the so-called 7 Sisters, are part of it. A large part of Bangladesh, and then of course Burma, Laos, Vietnam, parts of Thailand as well. So this is your Zomia. Historical change in Southeast Asia has actually been the result of what Scott calls a co-evolution of the hills and valleys, antagonistic but also connected. In other words, there is no real divide in historical terms between the valleys and the hills of Southeast Asia. But the hill populations are far more dispersed and culturally diverse from valley populations. Forest resources and open land allow for more diverse subsistence practices than what is practiced in the valleys, in the lowland areas. And this is where anarchism comes in probably. The social structure is more flexible and egalitarian than in the hierarchical codified valley societies. And multilingual peoples live side by side. And in these areas, the state has always been frustrated because people refuse to stay put. And although there is an anarchy of identity, there is a common order in the sense that they all live in the altitude areas. But what distinguishes Zomia from lowland areas is this status of relative statelessness. So it's not political unity that unites the people of Zomia because it is absent, but rather comparable patterns of diverse hill agriculture, dispersal, mobility, and egalitarianism. So Scott also brings in this whole issue of resistance, refusal, and refuge, because the hill populations of Southeast Asia have long resisted the projects of nation building and state making of the states to which it belongs. And if you go back to the colonial era, Europeans also underwrote, actually, surprisingly, the hills' autonomy as a counterfoil against anti-colonial movements, which is quite surprising. But the hills are also a space of cultural refusal, and not just due to the absence of political authority. But anyway, the absence of large, permanent religious and political establishments makes for a flat social, local sociological pyramid compared to valley society, where status and wealth distinctions tend to be supra-local and enduring, while in the hills they're confined and unstable. The sociologist Ferdinand Brodel cites an unbridgeable cultural gap between plains and mountains. So the mountains are actually a world apart from civilizations, which are urban and lowland. They have no written history. And just to stress the point, Shendel said, the fact is that civilizations simply cannot climb hills. Okay. So another point here is that Zomia has always been a region of refuge. So people from the lowland areas fleeing the state would always move up to the uplands and become bandits, subversives, rebels, etc., etc. But another major point here is that hill peoples are generally not remnants of aboriginal peoples. In other words, there is no such thing as an aboriginal people, because the so-called aboriginal peoples actually also came from the valleys over long periods of time. And the hills and the valleys have always had this symbiotic relationship. And wet rice agriculture, lowlands, state are basically new structures. They have not been around all the time. And most of the time, what you have actually been existing in Southeast Asia is this whole historical period of statelessness. So what has been dominant is a period of statelessness. What has been in the minority in terms of historical record is the period of state dominance and state power. Okay, better move fast now. Let me just skip this. So this is the last part. The thing to do as far as Scott is concerned is there's a need to really develop an anarchist history of Southeast Asia. And though Southeast Asia has been marked by the relative absence of states, histories of states persistently insinuated themselves. Because the whole history has actually been a history of state-making, even though that has been not the dominant aspect of the history of mankind, the history of peoples. Because, why is that? Because political units are the ones that leave the most physical evidence, whereas stateless communities and stateless peoples never leave any evidence, because that would be contrary. So no structures, no anchor, no burubudurs, nothing which historians can actually dwell on and write about in history. So the point here is that the more rubble you leave behind, the larger your place in the historical period. Okay, so Anthony Day, for example, suggests a different Southeast Asian history, or a different historiography of Southeast Asia, which is about establishing the elementary units of political order. In other words, instead of looking at the macro aspect of history, you go down to the micro aspect, and you will talk about nuclear families, to segmentary lineages, bilateral kindreds, hamlets, larger villages, small towns and their hinterlands, and confederations. So in a truly even-handed chronology of pre-colonial mainland Southeast Asia, most of the pages would actually be black, and that is actually the irony. So the suggestion here is to replace these imperial imaginings, probably in the Philippine context also to replace the imaginings of imperial Manila and look more at what has been taking place outside Manila, especially the southern part of the Philippines, and probably especially the Mindanao region. So this is a challenge for a non-state-centric history, specifying conditions for the aggregation and disaggregation of the elementary units of humanity. So the concept of Zomia in Scott's seminar work marks an attempt to explore a new genre of area studies in which justification for designating the area has nothing to do with national boundaries. This is not about national boundaries. This is not even about nation states or even strategic conceptions such as Southeast Asia. Because what we've shown here is that Southeast Asia is not equivalent to ASEAN. It also includes many of the provinces and states of other countries which ethnically, culturally, and historically actually belong to Southeast Asia. So this is rather based on ecological regularities and structural relationships that cross national boundaries. And to avoid being in the same state as Big Soto, here are my sources. Pareho lang yun.
Maraming salamat, Dr. Tadem.